It's the My Michelle Live podcast.
My Michelle Live, Health Watch. She's writing a prescription for hope. Here's Michelle.
Thank you, big voice guy, and happy Wednesday to you. Today, as we go live, I hope you're watching on all of the outlets that we are broadcasting on. You'll also hear this rebroadcast in full later at mymichellelive.com as we are all going through the corona crisis. Actions have consequences. Those consequences are consequences we are going to have to live with after all of the hoopla and decisions and vaccines and shutdowns. We have to live with those consequences. And some of those consequences we may have to live with for decades to come. That's why we need to have vibrant conversations. That's why we need to obliterate the cancel culture. And we have to be willing to listen to all sides and have a real conversation. Well, we are going to be doing that with my guest today. And I ask you to set aside time. If you can't listen to the whole podcast, save it, download it, listen to it later. Because there is a lot of information that is pertinent to you and to your future that we will be talking today with Dr. Jane Orient. Now, she is been in the medical field for some time in many aspects. She is with a mindset that I think helps us all to understand what's really going on in the world around us. She's editor of AAPS News, the Doctors for Disaster Preparedness Newsletter, and Civil Defense Perspectives. She's the managing editor of the Journal of American Physicians and Surgeons, and she is our guest today. And by the way, this isn't on her resume, but she's really patient. We had some technical difficulties this morning, and she wrote it out with us. So on top of everything else, we're so glad to have you with us, Dr. Orient.
Well, thank you. I have technical difficulties myself, so believe me, I sympathize.
And maybe that's a little bit of what we need in this day and age, a little bit of understanding, because what we've all experienced, whether we want to admit it or not, is an inability to have conversation. But some of these conversations, as I alluded to, have dire consequences. And are we not seeing that with this corona crisis?
Oh, I think we are. And I think it is really frightening that we have a cancel culture and that you're not allowed to express any dissent. I mean, if you disagree with something, or even if you ask a question, they consider you to be a flat earther or an anti-vaxxer or antisocial in some way, or maybe even accuse you of killing people.
And I got canceled for the first time on Facebook because I posted a news story on some of the negative consequences and deaths that have occurred from the virus. People should know so that we can make our own decisions where our bodies are concerned. But that got removed from Facebook. I was surprised. It wasn't outlandish. It was just an actual confirmed news story.
Yeah, well, that is terrible. I mean, without our freedom of expression, we are doomed. I mean, you can't even have science. Science absolutely requires people to be skeptical, to ask questions.
That's well put. And I wanted to delve in a little bit. We're going to talk about the effects of corona and the future and our children and specifically. But as long as we're lingering on the vaccine, there are a lot of stories that we should be aware of, and a lot of consequences and unforeseen consequences potentially in the future when we're shooting a vaccine into our system that hasn't been tested. There was a meme, doctor, on social media of two little mice, and one mouse asked the other mouse, "Did you get vaccinated yet?" The other mouse said, "No, they're still testing it on humans."
I think this is one of the most disastrous things happening. They have skipped the animal trials, and yet with a preceding virus, coronavirus 1, that had maybe 10 or 20 years ago, when they tested it on ferrets, the little ferrets made antibodies and it really looked terrific until they exposed them to the virus, and then they all got really sick and died.
Oh,
And why are we not paying attention to that? There's a thing called pathogenic priming, or antibody enhanced disease. It doesn't occur with all viruses or all vaccines, but with a certain set of viruses it does. Dengue respiratory syncytial virus and coronavirus. So why are we ignoring this past evidence? And now what we're doing is we're starting to use our children as guinea pigs. I mean, the children, I believe that we should use vaccines when they are safe, effective, and necessary. But in
absolutely.
children, they really are not necessary. And yet they're now starting to inject 12-year-olds with these vaccines. And we've had a few really tragic cases of children getting very sick and possibly dying.
I'd like to talk about that since we are not hearing those news stories. What do you know about some of the consequences of these vaccines in children? What we're seeing?
I think the same thing that occurs in adults, that there can be blood clots, that the spike protein that your own body it manufactures is harmful, whether it's on the virus itself or whether you're making it. And what it does, I think, is not entirely well known, but it seems to make platelets aggregate. You form blood clots, and then you don't have platelets, so that you both bleed or you clot. You can have clots in your brain, clots in your heart. Maybe that's what causes the COVID toes that people have been talking about. So this can have permanent, irreversible consequences, even death.
One of my concerns, as well, is in our state and in some other states, they're seeing an uptick in cases. And the question that is not being answered is, how many of these people have had the vaccine? How many of these hospitalizations and people being attributed with COVID are being counted as cases?
The statistics are really, really hard to interpret. I mean, what constitutes a case? Is that a PCR test that is far too sensitive and maybe a false positive in most cases? Is a death being attributed to COVID because of an infection that occurred 90 days ago? If a person dies after a vaccine, do we attribute the death to the vaccine or not? Or we just say that it's a coincidence? But there have been some really frightening statistics in some places, like in one Irish nursing home where the patients were doing fine. They had a big spike in deaths as soon as they got vaccinated against COVID. And then after the COVID, you'd expect, well, people would be well again, but the incidence of death is still higher than it was before they started vaccinating people. But all of these things, there's just a huge financial conflicts of interest out there. Billions and billions of dollars are at stake. And if people are hesitant to take these vaccines, well, that's a huge amount of money down the drain.
Yeah, and for some reason that's not putting a red light up, especially in the media, where here in the media, we do have a responsibility, Dr. Orient, to challenge. As you mentioned in science, science works best when you have people doubting, when you have people asking those hard questions and saying, wait a minute. So does the media. The media works best when there's a narrative and they say, aha, but let's look at this side, let's look at that side. And because we are not seeing it, we are seeing more of what maybe you and I grew up with, propaganda that we would look at being put out in socialist countries and behind the Iron Curtain and say, oh my gosh, I can't believe people believe that. And yet, here we are.
I think the media has the same problem as medical organizations, medical journals, that they are highly dependent on pharmaceutical advertising. And that the media could lose a huge amount of money if they breathe even some doubt about their main source of revenue. I think that medical journals certainly are basically owned by financial interests.
I wanted to get to some of the things that the future holds, especially where children are concerned. You had mentioned people rushing to get their children vaccinated. We are seeing people with their babies saying, please vaccinate my babies, while there's almost no risk at all. In fact, I would even argue, though I'm not a medical physician, that exposing ourselves to things and those little colds that we get only boost our immune system and help us to be stronger so that we can resist more violent attacks to our immune system.
Oh, I think that that is true. And we're finding out this hygiene hypothesis that the children whose mothers are, who constantly cleaning them or constantly not allowing them to touch anything, that these children are unhealthy. They get infections very often. They get chronic diseases. That I think children need to get dirty. They need to play outside. They need to be in the sun. They need the fresh air. They need hugs. They need playmates. They need to be in contact with the real world, not with the virtual world. They probably can't even learn how to use their hands properly if all they ever do is push buttons and click mouses.
And you wonder what will we develop into if we keep going down this road. I learned that lesson the hard way. I had a child who I sterilized. Okay, first time mom, I did that, doctor. Then someone came over to visit with a child who was, just about a week and a half older than mine. And the child was sitting there chewing on their father's shoe. And I'm going out of my mind. And then I realized my son had runny noses and ear aches and he was and this other kid, healthy as a horse. And suddenly, boom, the light went off. And that was what put me down the road to a better narrative. So much like that. And in our society, we're not learning that lesson. Fine, wash your hands. That's a good thing. It always is. But we don't want people outside. We see people in the media being demonized because they're at beaches without their masks on. These are super spreaders, when indeed, probably that's the safest place you could be, in the sun, in the fresh air, on the beach.
Well, I'm not saying don't wash your hands.
No.
The 50th time you do it, you're an obsessive compulsive neurotic. That's very, very bad for you. And you as a mom, you learned from an observation. Why aren't our public health people learning from these observations?
Yeah,
why are they teaching parents to be like that?
Indeed, and we are. But there is more concern that we need to take into account for our children. And I think it reaches into a myriad of areas, from the fear factor. We have made this coronavirus, when it was new and we were taking okay, let's step back and figure this out approach. I think that was a good idea. We didn't know. Once we knew, you would think, remember back when we said we're going to flatten the curve? What happened to that curve?
Right. Well, we flattened everything, as you said.
Yeah.
Or as some people have said.
And yet things have not changed back. So one thing that we really wanted to talk about was the next generation, because what we're doing is going to affect what's going to be taking place in the future. We're already seeing in our nation a population decline with our children. We're already seeing that the values that we can implant in our children, well, they're being overtaken by other ideologies, other ideas. Our children, our next generation, have now been in a mode where they're walking in fear. They're over-connected to devices. That's the only way they can school, have social interaction, and we're making really weird health choices for them. What does the future hold, and what are some of the other issues that we are putting on our children that are going to have negative effects, potentially?
Well, I think child psychologists are really, really concerned, because the children are growing up in fear. They're seeing every human being as a possible threat to them. They can't, they can't get close enough to other children to whisper or to pass notes even. And at least when we had to walk in straight lines, we were close enough that we could whisper and pass notes, and we did. That was very naughty. But anyway, children absolutely need to have contact with real human beings. And how can they function if everybody is just a threat? And everybody is surrounded by germs. We just are. That's part of being alive. And we need to develop our immune systems so that we can fight against them.
I think of that in other realms as well, in the emotional and spiritual realms. We are surrounded by trials and tribulations. We're surrounded by dangers and decisions. We're surrounded by things that can be a threat. And those very things are the things that strengthen our psyche, strengthen our spirit, help us to endure, give us the ability to overcome and be stronger in character. It makes us better people, better family members. It makes us a better nation. Also, I would say medically, we are surrounded, as you said, doctor, by germs. Those germs, even those ugly corona-looking germs that look like the Death Star from Star Wars, those things, as healthy people, as we strive to be healthy, strengthen our immune system, help us to be stronger. And I've said this every time we've talked about this. Why aren't we having a media frenzy about vitamin D, vitamin C, getting out in the sunshine, cutting out sugar, strengthening your immune system? Why are we not seeing that? I mean, they told us how to wash our hands like we were in kindergarten. Why couldn't we hear the rest of the story?
Well, that's exactly right. And there are plenty of studies to show that people who have enough vitamin D do very well, and people who are vitamin D deficient have a much higher chance of dying. But we're never going to be able to get rid of all germs. That's impossible. But what we are doing a good job of is getting rid of love, affection, joy, fun, the ability to learn, to experiment, to have contact with reality. These things we're getting rid of. And we're seeing even suicidal children, that a very high percentage of young people have, maybe a quarter of them actually thought about committing suicide. I mean, what are we doing to these children? And once they get past this time when they have the ability to learn these things, they may never be able to catch up.
And we are seeing that inability to connect does indeed have an effect not only on our children, but on those whose immune systems aren't strong, those who are hospitalized. We say, no, I'm sorry, you can't have your family members in, you can't have that human touch. Does that not have a great effect on people's ability and wherewithal to overcome the whatever it is that's plaguing their bodies?
Oh, I think so. I think that if you're going to recover, you need hope. You need connection with your family. You need to know that somebody cares. What we're doing and putting these people in hospitals isolation is just cruel, and it's not only brutal, but it is bad for them because the hospital doesn't have these outsiders seeing what's going on there and making sure that people are not being neglected and that they're being well treated. It's very important to have someone looking after you when you're in the hospital, to have outsiders knowing what's going on.
Yeah, I wanted to take some time, since you are well versed and you have an understanding as a doctor, and even with doctors for disaster preparedness, understanding that sometimes big bad things happen. What do we do? We started our conversation. I'd like to, as we wind things up, talk about what we do and how we can have conversation. We're not allowed to say, wait a minute, masks, and especially the way we're wearing them, just aren't that effective. Okay, and they're a little bit silly, and we're putting it on people who probably shouldn't be wearing a mask. People should be able to make their own decisions where vaccines are concerned. I'm not an anti-vaxxer, but I'm certainly be an informed vaxxer. I would like to speak to that because people are feeling isolated and they're saying, I don't feel comfortable, but I'm being bullied in this direction. Can you empower us?
I think people really need to look out for themselves and that they need to be prepared and informed. And instead, we're turning them all into helpless people who are just trying to follow directions that come down from public health authorities. And they're being restricted from having the information they need and being terrorized, like all this masking. I mean, not only does it not do any good, if you don't have coronavirus, there's no way you can give it to anybody. But the masks themselves, what are you inhaling from the masks? Children have said they feel like they're swallowing cat hair. And it turns out there are fibers in their masks that they're inhaling. Who knows what damage that does to their lungs in the long run? The men in California recently, a girl broke the record for the 800-meter dash face first because she was forced to wear a mask exercising outside. She had oxygen deprivation. She couldn't see, she couldn't hear, planted her face across the finish line, got a concussion. Who knows what other permanent damage she may do. And that's just totally absurd for somebody to be running with a mask on outdoors.
I live in Seattle. I go out for a walk or a jog every day, and there's people running, playing softball, all with masks. You know, it's to me, it's like putting a pillow on your face. We would never do it. You know, you never try to suffocate someone with a pillow, right? But it feels that way. It's so difficult, and we're living in this cattywampus world, and we put very little credence in our own immune system. If we needed a mask, our body would have one. And we do. It's called our immune system. I really appreciate your candor and educating us in such a balanced way. I wanted to ask you as my final question, though, what your main concern is as we are looking at the effects of this corona crisis.
I think our main concern is that we are going to have a lot of people dying unnecessarily. We already have had maybe hundreds of thousands of people dying because we do not treat early with well-established, safe drug remedies, that we've put all of our emphasis on. Let's get everybody vaccinated with untested, experimental, novel vaccines that have potentially devastating long-term effects.
And that is empowering. It's knowledge that we need to hear, but aren't hearing it. You have made time for us today. You've weathered my technical difficulties, and you have an important message that I think brings us back to a balanced approach to our health, our future, and our decisions. And I want to thank you very much, Dr. Orient, for your time today.
Thank you for the opportunity, Michelle.
And usually we have out music, but you know, Michelle is a little slow and we don't have our technical guy here today. We'll see if we can find it because you always appreciate it, but I'm going to ask you to like us, share us, and Dr. Orient, I hope you will come back on with us again sometime. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for your courage, Michelle.